The global trade order as we know it is shifting right before our eyes. For decades, the United States has been the anchor of international commerce, the partner everyone wanted at the negotiation table. But something remarkable is happening. In just the past few months, the European Union, Canada, and the United Kingdom have struck major trade deals with countries they once approached cautiously. India, China, and South America are suddenly the new priority partners. And here's what most people are missing: this isn't just about economics. This is about entire nations hedging their bets, reducing their dependence on American trade, and building backup plans for a more uncertain world. I'm Steven Nekander-Hørlund at Danish Social Science PhD, reporting for the Danish Dream Media Group. Let's start with what the European Commission itself called the mother of all trade agreements. On January 27th, after nearly 2 decades of negotiations, the EU and India finally signed a comprehensive free trade agreement. And when I say comprehensive, I really mean it. This deal covers goods, services, investment, protection, intellectual property, digital trade, and dispute settlement mechanisms. But what's actually remarkable is that this agreement represents the largest trade opening India has ever granted to any partner. The numbers are really staggering. The EU projects that this agreement will double their exports to India by 2032. Tariffs will be eliminated or reduced on 97% of EU goods by trade value. This translates to up to 4 billion euros in annual savings on duties for European exporters alone. Now you might be thinking, what about India? What do they get out of this? India secured preferential access across 97% of EU tariff lines, covering 99% of trade value. This means approximately 91% of Indian exports to the EU will face no import duties whatsoever. Let me give you some specific examples of how dramatic these tariff cuts really are. Concerning automobiles, tariffs slashed from 110% down to just 10% on a quota of 250,000 vehicles. Of the 4 million cars the EU imports, the number is of course insignificant for the EU, but for the up-and-coming Indian car industry, this can actually be really significant. If we look at machinery, almost complete elimination from current 44% tariffs. If we look at chemicals, it's a reduction from 22% to 0% for nearly all products. If we look at pharmaceuticals, it's an elimination of 11% of tariffs. Now, the EU does protect certain sensitive sectors. So beef, chicken, rice, and sugar remain fully protected and excluded from liberalization. But make no mistake, this deal is really massive. And here's the strategic angle everyone needs to understand as well. The EU is explicitly seeking to reduce trade dependence on China and the United States as well, of course. At the same time, India is trying to offset the impact of US tariffs and diversify away from protectionism. India has done really well when it comes to IT offshoring compared to China, which operates behind a firewall, and China also does not have the same cultural and linguistic ties to Europe as India has. But India is far behind China when it comes to manufacturing base and the quality of what is manufactured. This deal is therefore important for India to diversify its offering to the world as well as opening foreign markets. This is a big shift for India, and it's a diversification for the EU. Now let's talk about Canada. If the EU-India deal was the mother of all agreements, the Canada-China deal is the comeback nobody saw coming. In January, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney visited China. The result he got out of this was a Canada-China Economic and Trade Cooperation roadmap. Remember, this is happening after years of diplomatic friction between these two countries. But suddenly, pragmatism won, you could say, especially in the face of US threats against Canada. The centerpiece: electric vehicles. Canada agreed to reduce tariffs on Chinese EVs from over 100% down to 6.1%. But here's where it gets interesting. They're doing it with a managed approach. An initial annual quota of 49,000 Chinese EVs. And by 2030, 50% of this quota must be reserved for affordable EVs below 35 Canadian dollars. That's about 25,000 US dollars in value for each car. We are talking about making electric vehicles accessible to average Canadians, not just the wealthy, and maybe also hitting a little bit on the EV sector from the US. And of course, it's also a big blow to the US EV manufacturing, meaning Tesla and Elon Musk. But there is actually more coming out of this deal. Canada suspended tariffs on certain Chinese steel and aluminum imports until December 31st, 2026. Also, full suspension for 11 tariff lines, partial suspension for 55 additional lines as well. But what does China give Canada in return? First, it's about canola seeds. Here, tariffs are reduced to approximately 15% by March 1st, down from 85%. That's massive for Canadian farmers. Discriminatory tariffs removed on canola meal, lobsters, peas, and crabs through the end of 2026. Accelerated resumption of imports for beef, pet food, and animal genetics. So if we look at this trade agreement, what is the projection? Canadian exports to China could increase by 50% by 2030. The context really says it all. China is Canada's second largest single country trade partner, accounting for $119 billion in two-way merchandise trade in 2024. Canadian officials were quick to clarify this is not a comprehensive free trade agreement with China, but also it doesn't need to be. It's a strategic hedge, a backup plan, a diversification away from the total dependence on the American market. And it's a powerful signal to the US that more deals with China could follow. But what does this all mean in the bigger picture? First of all, let's be clear about one thing. These agreements aren't just about tariffs and trade volumes. They represent a fundamental shift in how countries think about economic security. For decades, the playbook was fairly simple. Align with the United States, build your trade relationship around American markets. Accept American leadership in return for stability. But that playbook is really being rewritten right now. The EU is building bridges to India while also renegotiating select items with China. They've been finalizing a trade agreement with the Mercosur, the South American trading bloc. In international trade and supply chain, stable partners and stable conditions for trade are super important. Just one number in a trade agreement can mean thousands of people getting laid off in a domestic sector. Therefore, trade arrangements and tariffs are not just something you change based on your presidential mood of the day. Businesses have spent billions to adjust and adapt to current market and trade conditions. If the rules of the game change every week in the US, it's a massive risk that companies will have to weigh against the potential in the US market. And of course, the potentials in the US market are huge, but so are the risks building as well. Before we end this video, let's have a look at the UK. The UK is approaching China with new overtures to diversify their post-Brexit trade relationships. And Trump was soon on X warning the UK that there could be consequences if it pursued further reapproachment with China. The UK situation is in many ways similar to that of the self-inflicted situation the US is in right now. An inflated and unrealistic belief in one's own abilities stemming from a surge in national sentiment fueled by immigration concerns and populism. The UK cut ties with the EU in the famous Brexit, which left it roaming alone pretty much. The UK should rule the waves again. Foreign markets would welcome UK trade delegations with open arms and red carpets. That was the plan back then. Waking up to the reality was harsh, and so far UK has made 0 trade agreements if we exclude the rollover trade agreements with EU, Australia, and New Zealand. What we are witnessing today is countries building multiple trade relationships in the world that no longer has a center. We are back to a multipolarity in trade and soon also in defense and security. In less than 400 days, Donald Trump and MAGA have managed to create a multipolar world, downgrading the US from the house on the hill to just another townhouse among equals. Countries are not abandoning the US necessarily, but out of necessity. They cannot afford to be dependent on the whims of an erratic president. While this has been underway for some time, as China and India have risen in influence, the USA has effectively sped everything up so much so that it's more looking like a run for the door to get out of dependency on the US rather than actually running towards embracing China and India. But that's the situation we are in. It all makes sense in an era of unpredictability and unpredictable trade policy, sudden tariff announcements, and shifting political whims. Diversification isn't just smart, it's survival. The Canada-China deal has been described as modest in scope, and it really is, but it creates a platform for future negotiations, and also it contains a lot of signal value to the US. It establishes dialogue, it compartmentalizes trade from political tensions as well. The EU-India agreement is anything but modest. It's transformative. It positions India as a counterweight to China in the EU-Asian strategy. Here's what I think is most important. These deals signal that the world isn't waiting for American leadership any longer. Countries are taking initiative, building their own networks, creating their own security. The global trade order of the next decade won't look like the last one. It will be multipolar, complex, regional blocs negotiating with other regional blocs. And the United States, still a major player, absolutely, but no longer the only game in town. If you liked this video and it helped you understand what's really happening in global trade right now, hit the subscribe button down below and consider sponsoring a cup of coffee for the news team using the link in the description. You can read more news on the DanishDream.com website. Thank you for watching.